As I said at the top of the show, Australians hoping to return home are likely to face major delays as changes are being put to the National Cabinet tomorrow in relation to COVID protocols for returning travellers. Now, there's talk of a cap. In the month of June, as I said, 65,000 people returned home. Given the quarantine costs, as I said, are around $5,000 per person for that 14-day period, that's a bill for the taxpayer on top of every other bill we're copying at the moment of over $300 million for 1 month only of quarantining. You can see why the security guards, the unionised security guards in Victoria wanted those contracts, can't you? Let's bring in my panel, Sky News host of Across Australia, Peta Credlin from Brisbane, and Radio 2GB's broadcaster and Sky News host extraordinaire, Chris Smith from Sydney. Chris, it sort of all makes sense on a couple of fronts. First of all, I was gobsmacked that was 65,000 people who came back last month. I was gobsmacked that you're talking about over $300 million. I mean, that is serious money for quarantining. But it all started to add up as to why Martin Pakula, the Victorian minister in charge of quarantining, was wanting to ensure, allegedly, his union was looked after in getting some of these contracts rather than the police and rather than the army. Anything surprise you in all of this?
Oh, that's how it works in Victoria. You know, we hear this all the time. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why there's been a delay in getting all of those ADF staff down in Victoria is because the police union, from what I've been told from inside the corridors, the police union said to those who had to make the decision, hang on a minute, this is our turf. We'll be in charge of this. We want to, you know, it could be overtime for our members, etc., etc. That's how it works in Victoria. As for quarantine, though, Peter, it was almost 4 months ago when the Prime Minister got up at a press conference and said outside Parliament House, if you are overseas travellers and you're around here in Australia at the moment, it might be time for you to go home. And for Australians, I would recommend that you come home too. 4 months later, we have this, you know, this procession of Australians making their way dopily back into Australia. It's got to be over, doesn't it? The freebie quarantining, the $5,000 over 14 days has got to be stopped. We've got to give them a week and say, hey, if you want to come back after a week expires, you're going to have to pay for this yourself.
Now, Chris, it's very interesting. Numbers that I'm getting, and I'm still going through them carefully, but they're not all Australian citizens. Some are permanent residents. And if you look at the Prime Minister and other language at the top of the crisis, they're talking about the family of both. And I've been told by security guards that some of the people coming to Australia and being quarantined have never been to Australia before. So I'm asking questions. I'll see whether that's accurate or not, and I'll come back and report on this show. But Gleeso, you're in the hot seat because I've got a bone to pick with you. What's this that foreign travellers can return, well, you know, Australians who have been living overseas in a foreign country can return to Queensland, but Victorians, even if we're prepared to pay for our own 2 weeks of quarantining, you don't want to know us.
Don't shoot the messenger. I don't set Queensland government policy, but I can agree with you wholeheartedly, Peta Credlin. I mean, you can't even come into Queensland because you're stuck in that Sictoria, as I saw a headline the other day in the Mexican state. But look, I think when you think about what Palaszczuk has done consistently, she's got this entrenched belief that the health priority of Queensland is her number one priority. And you can agree with that. You can understand that because she has certainly flattened the curve here. But look, I think when you look at the inconsistencies attached to the fact that international visitors can come here, and as you just mentioned, I can't believe it's $5,000 for 2 weeks in a hotel quarantine scenario. That's outrageous. But there is certainly some inconsistencies being applied to COVID-19 policies when it comes to restrictions in Queensland. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work that one out.
Yeah, I don't think it's been a long time since you stayed in a hotel. It must have been a long time because, you know, you're talking about $300-400 a night, plus all the food and everything else and security. I could see how it would easily end up being $5,000, Gleeso. I want to ask you, Chris, though, this is sort of in the same vein because we're talking about, you know, bringing down the numbers of Australians being able to return home from tomorrow if it goes through with National Cabinet's decision. But Melbourne's top universities, they're still pushing for the foreign students. In the paper today, Margaret Gardner, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Monash University, she says international students are not able to return to campus in Australia. If they don't, we risk them turning to other places in the world and basically we'll lose them forever. Now, how does this work if we're going to scale down the number of Australians being able to return home? At the same time, you've got this push on foreign students increasing in number. How's that fair?
I get the feeling that the Prime Minister is on side with the universities in terms of creating special flights and special exemptions for foreign students to come into Australia and be quarantined for the applicable time before returning to university. I get the feeling he's on side with this. We've got the Canberra, 350 going to Canberra, and I think this will be rolled out. But you know what I hate about, you know, these chancellors and these university types getting on the front foot and getting onto social media and saying, Australia welcomes you. It just sounds weak. It sounds as if they're greedy, they're desperate. They're not desperate. Look, at the end of the day, the Chinese know that Australia's a great place to study. They also know we're a very good place in terms of the outbreak of the pandemic. We're a safer place than it would be, for instance, in most parts of America. We're on pretty good footing, I would have thought. Yes, they're going to do their dough in because there's been this massive lockdown, but there's been this lockdown right around the world. They've just got to, you know, harden up and take what comes to them and stop getting out saying Australia welcomes you. I just think it's pathetic.
Well, they've got to have cost recovery. The universities have to pay for it themselves, or the students coming here, absolutely not the Australian taxpayer. That's the first point I'd make. But also, this is a very salient lesson for the universities because they over-capitalised on the foreign student market.
100%.
They've got themselves into trouble and they're so afraid to speak up. We see this case again, right across our universities with Confucius centres. And we go back to, again, more today on this University of Queensland stuff. Gleeso, Drew Pavlou, his lawyers are referring a number of university executives to the Queensland Crime and Corruption Commission because they say, and it's still a claim to be tested, but they say the university itself was involved in corruption and a failure to disclose foreign influence. This is an issue, Gleeso.
It is an issue, and Pavlou has been incredibly aggressive, as has his legal counsel. Good luck with referring it to the CCC. You know, they are seen in this state to be somewhat ineffective. They couldn't nail Jackie Trad when prima facie the evidence was pretty overwhelming that there were issues there. So good luck with referring it to the CCC. But I guess this comes back to the point that Chris was just making then, and you were just making then, Peter, and that is this over-reliance that we have on China when it comes to our tertiary students. I mean, they make up at least a third of the numbers that are currently in our universities. And I think this is all part of the new paradigm. We have to look at diversifying ourselves away, not just from trade when it comes to China, but also our addiction to their international students. Now, in many ways, they're a victim of their own success because we are seen as a particularly good place to educate students. But I think this is an area where we have to wean ourselves off this constant Chinese, you know, sort of addiction to the yuan, to their currency.
Just a quick one, I'll bring Chris in on this though, it's got a bit of Queensland history. What's the story today? There's mixed reports on coal and Labor. You've got two federal frontbenchers, Joel Fitzgibbon and Shane Newman, weighing into the extension of this pretty controversial New Ackland mine. A lot of critics with the mine, including Alan Jones, who's spoken to me about it and got me across some of the detail. It looks like the state government is not going ahead with the mine, but the federal MPs, those two I mentioned at least, are pushing really hard for Labor to back it. Where's it up to?
Me, Peter?
Gleeso.
Is that to me,
No,
Peter?
sorry,
Yeah,
Gleeso,
sorry.
that's to you,
Well,
Queensland issue.
Yeah. Sure. Look, interestingly, I just had Joel Fitzgibbon did a pre-record for my Win show. It's all part of the right wing of the Labor Party embracing coal, embracing the miners, embracing workers, because they know that the left-wing faction of the party, and we saw this happen in central Queensland on May 18 last year, when the left-wing faction, when the Labor Party abandoned the workers in central Queensland at the last election, that's where they lost the election. So Fitzgibbon's saying this is about jobs, and this is a ruse by the Palaszczuk government. They're saying that it's caught up in the courts. Well, it's in the High Court because the Green activists have put it there in the High Courts, and that's the reason it's there. I think it won't get the okay before October 31, but it's interesting that the mechanics behind Fitzgibbon and Shane Newman coming out saying we need to embrace coal is at direct odds with some of those on the left of the Labor Party.
Just a quick comment for you too, Chris. We're told a whole lot of protesters will be back in the streets of Brisbane. These are Extinction Rebellion types. It relates to a refugee issue, and a Greens councillor, Jonathan Shree, is also involved. Don't the rules apply to them?
Wherever he's involved, you can just go tut, 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 because this bloke is a train wreck, dead set. At a time when we do not need another spike, in particular in places like Queensland, that are virtually through the pandemic, why would you bung this on? They think they're immune from the virus, and certainly the Premier has made them immune from the law. Maybe that's what needs to change here. Maybe we need to make an example out of this lot of protesters, whatever they're pushing, whether it's asylum seekers or too many black ducks. What we need to do is say, hey, round them up, put them in the back of the paddy wagon. If they don't social distance, they can stand and protest as much as they want, but they've got to do what law-abiding citizens are doing throughout Queensland, which is social distance. And if they don't, enough's enough.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Chris Smith and Peter Gleeson.
Thanks, Peter.